So next step is installing the engine shaft and the clutch. Now before that can even start on the mower, there's a couple of steps that need to be completed. One being the clutch cork needs to be glued into the clutch half. The thrust bearing needs to be pressed into the clutch half, and the self-aligning bearing needs to be pressed into its bearing housing. I'm going to start with the clutch cork, and this is how I do that. Okay, you want to find yourself a good quality contact adhesive. I've been using this one a couple of times now, and I've never had a problem with it, so I'm going to stick with it. The point of contact adhesive is to apply glue onto both surfaces, so on the cork and inside the clutch half. Now you have to, once you install the glue evenly, you want to let the glue dry until it's sort of touch dry. It becomes a bit tacky to touch. Once it's tacky, then you're right to install both halves together. And this creates an incredibly strong bond, so you have to be quite cautious when you do it, because as soon as you touch them together, you pretty much got Buckleys of separating them again. So here we go. So it's a quite warm day today, and I can see that the glue is starting to dry. It's becoming very sticky to touch. So now's the time to insert my cork. Right. Once I've got that in there, what I like to do is put the clutch cone through. Now make sure there's no glue on here, otherwise you will glue your clutch cone in, and you don't want to do that. So the reason I do this is this applies an even pressure around the cork. So I'll pop my clutch half and clutch cone to the side. Now I've set it up on a couple of blocks, and then I've put a couple of weights on top. So I'm using bricks. Now that's just applying downward pressure onto the cone, which is then applying an even pressure to the clutch cone. Okay, next I'm going to install the self-aligning bearing into the bearing housing. Now there's a bearing seal which actually goes on the back side of the bearing housing, like so. You don't need that just yet. When you install that on the mower, you will need that. However, just pressing this bearing in, not necessary. So on the inside of the housing, there's a lip right at the back. Now you want to press your bearing all the way down to that lip. So I think I've showed this in a previous video. I use a vise just to pinch them together, and that slides the bearing in quite easily. So when you find you push it in with the vise, you'll find that it doesn't actually quite push it in far enough. this is quite easy to achieve. Mine actually I just pushed in with my fingers. However, you can get a socket, put it on there, give it a bit of a tap. That will press it in that tiny bit extra. Okay, next of all, we're going to install the thrust bearing into the clutch half. So this is the half of the clutch that mounts onto the engine. These thrust bearings are incredibly tight. They're meant to be tight. It's not an issue. They're meant to be tight. That's how they are. So how I do it, I get the thrust bearing, I sit it on top of the clutch half. Now I get a flat bit of timber and I put that on top. I grab a hammer and then I give that a tap. Now it's tight. Once I've given that a tap, it starts the bearing to be pressed in. Alright. Once I've got to this point, I go and use the vise. I find that the vise pushing the bearing in evenly. I don't know if you can see on camera. Just with the hammer and a bit of timber, the bearing is actually on an angle. So if you were to continue to do that, your bearing will go in an angle. You don't want that. You want that to be flat as. I find that the vise... Okay, so I've just discovered that my metal vise here isn't big enough, which is a pain in the butt, but what's happening is the outer edge of the clutch half is actually hitting the bottom of the vise. Now that's preventing pressure being applied to the center of bearing. So if I was to press that in like that, the bearing would actually go in not straight. So that's a bit of a bugger. I've had to knock the bearing in a bit further with the hammer. I've got it as straight as I can, but never fear, I've got another vise. It's a timber vise. It's a bit bigger. Right, so this is a timber vise. It's only small, but it's big enough. The lighting over here is a bit bad, but you'll have to bear with me. Okay, now we've pressed the bearing in with the vise. We've got that sitting flush. Now, because that bearing's sitting flush, it's still not deep enough. It's got to go all the way down until you hit the lip inside the clutch half. However, now the bearing is in. It means when you push that, it's got no choice but to go straight. So when you apply pressure to that, it's going to evenly go down. So from this point onwards, you can actually not make your bearing go in on an angle. Now, instead of hitting that with a hammer, because I just don't like doing that, I have made my own little jig to squish this bearing all the way in till it hits the lip. I'll show you that jig. So it's quite simple. Just a couple bits of timber and a bolt. So basically what I do is timber with a hole in it, bolt through that, goes through one side. On the other side, I've got a bit of timber. Now I've used the hole saw just to make it round. Onto our bolt, washing a nut. And try and get that as centered as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. As I said, the bearing will go on straight. Right, now we've got it set up. All we do is tighten the nuts. Now as we tighten that nut, it's going to push the bearing down as the thread gets tighter. Rightio. Our bolt's done nice and tight. the bearing is pulled in. You can see there's now a lip from the top. We're hitting the seat at the back of the clutch half, so we can take our jig off. And there we have it. Our thrust bearing has been pressed into our clutch half. Right, so now we've done all the pre-work, we can assemble the clutch. Once we've assembled the clutch, we can mount the engine shaft and slide the clutch on. So next step, assemble the clutch. This is not a hard thing to do. Basically just bringing both clutch halves together. Inside the clutch there's a spring, this spring here. This sits at the bottom of the clutch cone, which will ultimately end up sitting here. And when you engage your handle up here, that presses the spring, disengaging the clutch. So it's just a matter of putting both clutch halves together, spring in the middle, and a couple of bolts. So you'll see, that's both clutch halves, tighten up the nut and bolts, and we are done. There we have it, clutch cone can still get pressed in. You will note the counterbalance I have not installed. Now I currently am not sure what motor I'm going to put on this mower. When half your clutch half is steel and the other half is aluminium, it creates an imbalance in the clutch when it's spinning on the engine. So to counteract that, these counterweights are installed. Now, because I'm unsure of the engine that I'm going to put on here and whether or not I'm actually even going to need this, I'm just going to leave it off for now. However, you'll see it can only go in one place. There's a small little knob on the clutch shaft which actually prevents you from putting it anywhere bar the right spot. Right, a couple of holding pins, just put them in finger tight. And there you have it, clutch is assembled. Alright. Now we've got the clutch assembled, we can install that onto the engine shaft. First of all, we have to install the engine shaft on the mower. So first step is your self-aligning bearing housing. Make sure you've got the rubber seal on the back. This housing has a hole on one side, that hole needs to point up. Now that's actually an oiling hole, so every time you use your mower, you're meant to drop a bit of oil down there. That drops into the bearing here and lubricates it. So, first step, a couple of bolts, bolt that onto the mower. Once we have that tight, we can insert the engine shaft. I like to push this rubber seal. So this rubber seal sits next to the bearing housing. It just prevents dirt going in this way into the bearing. So I push that on first. That's a tight fit. It just saves me pushing it all the way down here. Push that through our bearing as far as we can. Like so. Next step is going to be our thrust pad. So this is a brand new brass one. Again, this has a hole in one side. That hole has to go up. It's another oiling point. So just drop a few bits of oil in there every time you mow. Slide this on. There's a washer that pairs with that. Make sure you don't forget. Once we've done that, we want to insert our woodroof key. Like so. Now we can install our clutch. So our clutch has got a keyway. This keyway needs to line up with our woodroof key. And there we have it. Our clutch and engine shaft has been mounted.